Hey YouTube, today we're going to do a follow-up video on comparing a Dan Wesson Valor to a Wilson Combat Professional. And before we get any further, I'm going to let you know that both of these 1911s here have been safety checked, and as I pick them up, I will show you that they are not loaded. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the internal differences and the difference in the price on a Dan Wesson semi-custom 1911 versus a full custom Wilson Combat. And when I say Wilson Combat, you can think of this as any of the four major companies that most people come to mind, which is Ed Brown, Les Bear, Wilson Combat, or Nighthawk. So we're going to start off with the Wilson, or the Dan Wesson here. I'm going to show you that there's not anything in it. Now, this is a semi-custom, high-end, off-the-shelf 1911. And when I did a previous video on the differences in something like this, and if you were to buy like a custom gun like this. So today we're going to break it down and go a little bit further in depth and what some of the differences is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you both of these. I'm going to show you this Wilson Combat, also it's not loaded. And we're going to break these down, and we're going to show you some of the internal differences. The other video more showed you some of the outlines of the finish work on the outside and the tightness and all that. Now we're going to go a little deeper. I did not mention in the first video, one of the things about it is a company like Wilson Combat here, for example, they make all their parts in-house, all of them. Everything is made, all their barrels, all their frames, slides, everything is made in-house to complete this gun. Now, Dan Wesson, they make, I think, about 80%, 90% of the stuff in-house. But there's a couple things I've heard from forums and stuff that, like this grip safety isn't made there. And I know this barrel bushing isn't made there. But that would be one thing. Wilson Combat crafts all their own in-house products, and they use them on their guns. And Dan Wesson's getting closer and closer by the day. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this gun down here, and we're going to show you some of the differences. One of the first things I noticed about a Dan Wesson is I am able to turn this this barrel bushing without using a tool. And most of the real custom high-end 1911s that have a standard bushing on them, they're so tight that you cannot do that very easily. So that's one thing that really sticks out in the mind, and I actually like that because guns put together pretty darn tight, and you don't have to have a special tool to disassemble it, and that's always a plus to me. So we're going to take this apart, and we'll take all the little stuff out of it here, and we'll set it aside, and we'll break down the other one here, and then we'll start looking at some of the differences and why a Wilson Combat costs so much more than a Dan Wesson. So now we'll go with Wilson Combat. Wilson Combat's going to go together a little bit different here than, because it doesn't have a standard bushing on it. So you would break this thing more down like a Glock. You know, you have to hold this thing, hold tension on the slide to pull the slide stop out of it, and then it just releases off of here. And this one's a little bit harder to take the spring and stuff out of it because it's got like a longer flat wire spring on it, but very easy. No kind of barrel bushing on the front of them. Let's see if we can do this without fumbling around too much here. Oh, we got to take the plug out of it. I always forget something when I do this stuff on camera, folks. Alright, so we've got two of them completely broken down, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at the slides on them first. And so in my left hand, I'm going to have the Dan Wesson slide. This is a semi-custom gun, and I'm going to have the Wilson Combat one on my right hand. And we're going to start looking at some of the internal differences, and we'll notice that there isn't a whole lot of difference, folks, and machine work and all that. Both of these things are excellent, very finely crafted, put together slides, and they're both made from stainless steel, and I do not see a whole lot of difference in them. So we're going to look at it up close, and if you look at the one here on the left, This is your Dan Wesson, and as you can see, there's no kind of burrs or anything like that. The machine work's done very well on this. I mean, I'm talking exceptional. But if you look at the Wilson, they just take a little bit more, pay a little bit more attention to detail on their finished product. So if you look at them side by side, you'll see the difference in the finish work on them. And this is where some of this extra money comes from, folks. And stuff like this does not matter with the function of the firearm. That's why I mentioned in the first video that you might want to take a good look. If you want to take that next step up and you're not ready to lay down this much cash on buying like a Wilson Combat, this is actually a very good option. But as you can see, you know, there's going to be little bit differences like that. So if you look at things like the end of this slide here, if you look at the serrations on the Wilson, you can see they're cut all the way down, and you can see in between each one of the grooves on the slide serrations on the slide. And if you look at the Dan Wesson, it's not the same. They don't do things the same way. It's just cut out by a CNC machine. And like I said, does that make a difference in functionality? It absolutely does not. It makes no difference whatsoever, but just little things you notice when you're looking at why something costs like a whole lot more than it does another. So very little differences. If you look at the machine work on the inside, I know the Dan Wesson's a little bit more dirty because it was shot here recently and did a really quick cleaning, not a white glove cleaning on it. But if you look at the craftsmanship, you know, they're going to be very similar on the insides. You know, there's not going to be a whole lot of differences in craftsmanship. You look on the inside of the slide, this is your Dan Wesson slide on it. The finish is very nice. This is a bead blasted finish on this, and the Wilson, it's got like polished sides and bead blasted on the top, but the craftsmanship's about the same. Now, when you look at like the top, this isn't really fair because this one has serrations. It's been paid extra to have serrations put on them. The sights, you know, I think they're going to be very equivalent. Now, one of the differences that you will notice when you look at like the ejector right here, you look real close. Let me see if I can get this to focus. It's very well finished off, but you can actually see like little gaps and stuff in here, and it does stick out just a tiny bit, but just very tiny, and they're all going to vary a little bit here and there. On the Wilson, you're never going to see that. It's just going to always be very uniform and just very well finished off. And excuse me for it being a little dirty on these close-ups, but I mean, I do what I can, folks, to take care of stuff. I do everything I can. All your finished work around like the ejection port and all that, you know, there's no sharp edges or anything on this Dan Wesson or anything like that. If you look at the Wilson, they just take it to the next level, you know, with their finished work and stuff like that, and the machining and everything. It's just, if you look at little edges like this, see how perfectly they're machined off and everything like that. And when you look at the Dan Wesson, it's not quite the same attention paid to detail, but it's very close, very close. Does it warrant, you know, like $2,000 difference? No, but you can see where the extra money would go. And when you look at custom stuff like this is just the end of the slide. This one was paid extra, had these carry cuts put in. So I don't think Dan Wesson offers that. I don't think you can call them up and say, I want carry cuts put in my, you know, on my slide or anything like that. But maybe they'll get there one day. But just attention to details that stuff makes. And, you know, skilled labor costs a lot of money these days, folks. Any kind of labor costs a lot of money, but skilled labor that does stuff like this, it really costs a lot. Now, when you look at your frames are going to look very similar to when you first look at them. And, well, whoops, we're going to do it without banging them together, too. So when you look at them side by side, very, very similar. The craftsmanship's going to be pretty much the same. There's going to be no mem parts or anything in either one of them. And obviously the Dan Wesson's going to be on the left, and the Wilson Combat's going to be on the right. I did mention that there's a little bit of a gap difference in the grip safety on the Dan Wesson on the left, and there is a Wilson on the right. It's just a little bit more attention to detail paid. There's no magwell on the Dan Wesson, so we can't really compare that, but the Dan Wesson is bobbed off and the Wilson isn't, so that's kind of cool. There's no AMI safety on this particular one. That has nothing to do with being custom or anything, but here's where we start getting into a little bit of differences here. If you look at the Dan Wesson here, this is where your slide stop comes through, and on the Wilson Combat, this one's been countersunk to keep things from snagging. You just pay a little bit of extra money for stuff like this, to be done. You look at the front of the frames, same thing I was showing you with the slides. There is no sharp edges or anything on this Dan Wesson. It's just very well machined off and everything like that. But if you look at the Wilson, it's perfect. When you look at it around, it's just an absolute masterpiece. So when you look at them side by side, here's your differences. It's just anti-snag stuff that you pay for with Wilson. It's just a little bit more precise machine work here, but nothing to really write home about. Now, one of the differences I do notice on these things is when you look at like the feed ramps in here, the Wilson I do think has a little bit better feed ramp job done on it, and I'm going to try and show you this on camera. When I pick this Wilson up and I rotate this thing around, all the way around, you can see this thing is so finely hand fit in here and polished out. This whole feed ramp is, and I'm going to try my best to get this to focus, folks, but when you turn this around, it's just perfectly blended in. This feed ramp is on this gun, and just the way the craftsmanship, the attention to detail that paid, because it's very important on 1911 for the shells to feed into it. If you look at on the Dan Wesson here, it's done very well, folks. I'm not going to take anything away from what they did here, but when I take this thing and rotate it around, you can see a definite line where it cuts off. And I think a CNC machine cut this out, and maybe somebody put a little bit of handwork into it, but you can see a definite line when you look right down here when it focuses, where the polishing stops and the regular forged frame goes on. And I did not mention that, but these are both forged frames. These are all forged frames and slides, no mem parts in either one of them, so they're all going to be material wise pretty equivalent, but just little things like that, the little line on the feed ramp here, and you don't notice that with the Wilson. The Wilson's a little bit better finished off, and like I said, that's very expensive labor, very a skilled craftsman going into doing their craft, and that's going to be pretty expensive, experience. Things like this, like when you look at like the small parts, the Wilson's going to be in my right hand and the Dan Weston's going to be in my left. I'd say these are pretty darn close to exact, the same quality. There's not really any difference. I'm not going to say there's any difference in these. The barrels, they're both match grade barrels. Now, the difference is going to be the fluted barrel on the Wilson. That's just something you pay extra for. But folks, that's cosmetic. If it's worth a couple $1,000s for you to have a fluted barrel and on a custom gun, I understand it. Obviously I did it, so I'm not gonna go off on anybody for doing that. Now, these are different types of barrels, so this really isn't fair. This is a bull barrel, so it's flared on the end. Doesn't have a conventional 1911 barrel bushing, but these are both match grade barrels, very, very finely crafted together, and these are made in-house by each one of these companies. Dan Wesson does make their own barrels, and Wilson makes their own barrels. Now, what I've heard in the past is Dan Wesson does not make these barrel bushings, which I think is kind of odd. This would be a simple piece, in my opinion, to manufacture to fit over the barrel, and I think that has a lot to do with why it's just kind of a loose fit over this barrel to barrel bushing. When you get into the really high-end custom ones, these things are so tight it takes a tool to take them apart. And this one not the case, and no Dan Wesson I've ever seen is the case. But that does not affect the accuracy whatsoever, folks. It's just this gun's more accurate than I will ever be. I can tell you that. So when you look at things like the recoil spring and the guide rod, very well made. It's all, you know, these are all tool steel parts and everything that goes into these things. This particular Wilson has a longer guide rod on it, and it has a flat wire mainspring on it. So that's going to be your difference there. The flat wire mainspring, I think, is just more of a wear thing, and it also makes it feel like it works a little smoother. And this has got a little Wilson buffer on it for recoil purposes. A lot of people take this off. That's either a love or hate thing, but if you look at it real close, the quality is about the same on each one of them. So I'm gonna give the internal parts, you know, probably a tie on it. It's just the Wilson's just finished off a little bit better, you know, just a little bit more time taken. Look at things like the plugs on them. I know they're different kind of plugs, but I mean, how much better is a Wilson one than a Dan Wesson one? I would say none. You know, they're going to be about the same, folks, on the inside. So basically, in a nutshell, you see the whole inside, and I'm here to tell you that this Dan Wesson, the value that you get for what you pay for one of these, when you want to go into when you want to take that next step and get really high end into your 1911s, there's not a lot of difference in these Dan Wessons than there is the Wilson Combats. I mean, there is some differences, and if some of that stuff matters to you, I would absolutely recommend ordering a Wilson or a Nighthawk or something like that. But the average person like me and you, the people that watch my videos, you're not going to see that big a difference for the amount of money that you're going to pay and price to buy a Dan Wesson versus that. This is going to be at least, when you go into a Wilson, you're going to pay at least $1,500 more just the base, just to enter that world. And the more stuff you add on, like this stuff here, it's going to be, you can almost buy 2 of these Dan Wessons for what you could buy with this fully decked out custom Wilson. And does it look cool? It absolutely does. But does it warrant the cost? That's all up to you, folks. I'm just telling you that these are very well made, very high quality gun, and these are not cheap by any means. I mean, that is not a cheap gun whatsoever. But when you start comparing it into a custom shop gun that's all custom put together by high skilled gunsmiths that make a lot of money for what they do, that's when you start getting into the questions of, is it worth it or not? But anyway, folks, I've rambled on long enough. I wanted to do a follow-up video showing you some of the internal parts. But if you have any questions on any of this stuff, feel free to ask. I am pretty knowledgeable about 1911s, and I will answer every question to the best of my ability. Thank you very much for watching my video today, and you folks have a great day.